And then we started looking at this example, which illustrates how the autonomic nervous system brings about a reflexive response. This is an example of the autonomic reflex. Okay, so the first thing we have here is an example of a person standing up. So if you're lying down in a supine position and your legs are elevated, typically the blood in your body is not circulating towards your legs. Right? So when you stand up from that lying down position, most of the blood will then pool into your lower extremities, your lower limbs. And this is because of the force of gravity. This is a natural phenomenon. This happens even while we're not aware of it. Right? So as soon as you stand up, all of the blood typically pools into your legs and your limbs. This creates an issue because the systemic arteries, right, arteries everywhere else in your body, your upper limbs, your head, neck, trunk, will typically perceive that as a deficiency in blood, right? Does that kind of make sense? If blood is pooling into your lower limbs, then everywhere else in your body is going to perceive that we have a lower perfusion, we have a decrease in blood flow. Okay. Now, the visceral receptors that are present on some of those other vessels in the body will detect that decrease in blood pressure. So these visceral receptors, let's say in your arms or in your thorax, will detect that there's a decrease in blood flow and register that as a decrease in blood pressure. That is going to set off a signal, right? That's setting off an afferent pathway signal, which is basically going to tell the central nervous system, the brain, there's a decrease in blood flow, and the language that the body uses to communicate that is by decreasing the frequency of action potentials. We spoke about frequency coding, right? If you remember what frequency coding is, this was basically the way that the body communicated different magnitudes of a signal. So if you perceive a loud sound, for example, you would have more action potentials being fired. You have a higher frequency of action potentials versus the perception of a softer sound or more quiet sound. All right, so this is an example of that. The way that the body sends the signal to the central nervous system is by decreasing the frequency of the action potentials. And that will tell the nervous system something is wrong. You have a decrease in perfusion, you have a decrease in blood pressure. So it sends a signal to some of the cardiovascular centers, which are in the medulla oblongata. And those centers, which are an example of integrated centers, right, which we talked about earlier, are basically going to take that information, integrate it, and generate two responses. What do you think those two responses would be? I send a signal to the central nervous system that blood flow has decreased. The central nervous system that controls the heart and the heart rate, what would the response be from the brain to the heart? What would the brain be trying to tell the heart in response to this signal? Come on, if you decrease blood pressure, what would the brain be telling the heart in terms of the autonomic nervous system? Right, it'd be telling it to pump faster, right? Because we're perceiving a signal of decreased perfusion. The response to that signal, to rectify that signal, to turn that signal off, would be to increase the heart rate or to tell the heart to pump faster, right? That would be increasing the activity of which division of the nervous system? Which division of the nervous system would be increased to increase heart rate, increase contractility of the heart? It would be your sympathetic, right? So you increase your sympathetic output, and what would you want to do to your parasympathetic? You'd want to decrease it, right? That was the example of that dual innovation we talked about. So if you increase the sympathetic outflow, it would only make sense to decrease your parasympathetic. And that's the signal that the cardiovascular centers in the brain would send down to those effector tissues. In this example, that's the heart. Okay, and this is going to be on the efferent pathway. Now, we talked about two types of fibers, two pathways. Signals going from effector tissues or visceral receptors. Visceral receptors up to the central nervous system are afferent signals on afferent pathways. versus signals that are coming from the central nervous system back down to the affected tissue. Are going to be doing so on efferent fibers. Okay, so the brain sends this signal to the heart, telling it to increase its sympathetic activity and in the same breath decrease its parasympathetic activity. Now that is going to bring about a increase in blood pressure, right, which is going to stop that original signal of decreased blood pressure which we first had when we stood up. Right, can everyone see how this signal happens even while we're unaware of it? So every time you stand, this phenomenon takes place. And because this is an autonomic reflex, it's an autonomic response, we have zero cognition of this happening. Okay, this just happens autonomically. All right, any questions on this? So this is one example of how this, the autonomic nervous system, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, can bring about several responses. Okay, so just to really back up and talk about regulation here, we talked about the two divisions of the nervous system. Some of the activities or functions of the parasympathetic were quietness, or if you're in a relaxed state, right? The rest and digest, if you're in a period of resting and digesting, you would influence parasympathetic activity. So this is going to be gastrointestinal activities, gastrointestinal motility, so digesting of food, as well as juices, so gastrointestinal juices, and salivary secretions, lacrimal secretions, and so on and so forth. It's also going to decrease heart rate, decrease blood pressure, and then decrease respiratory rate as well. Right, so parasympathetic is pretty much toning everything down. And this is your rest and digest division of the nervous system. The sympathetic activity, on the other hand, is going to be your flight or fight response. And if you remember, I said earlier, it could be fight, flight, or freeze. This prepares the body for any type of emergency situation, stress, exercise falls under this division as well. And then any sort of perceived threat. So even if you're not being physically threatened, this can be elicited through an emotional response as well. So if someone verbally threatens you, this can elicit a sympathetic response as well. This helps to mobilize energy stores, so breaking down food, breaking down glucose. This will also dilate the pupils, which will only make sense if you're in a situation of being threatened or an emergency or stress or exercise. You want the pupils fully dilated, as much light coming in as possible, so that you can fully prepare yourself for that threat. And then lastly, this will decrease gastrointestinal juices and then urinary function. If you've ever been frightened or startled and you had to use the bathroom before that, sometimes that just goes away. Depending on how full the bladder is, sometimes you can probably urinate on yourself if you lose that urinary control. Okay, so these are some of the functions that are brought about by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, now what's important to understand is that at rest, there is tonic activity. So tonic activity basically means both branches of the autonomic nervous system are equally contributing to all of those effector organs we talked about. Okay, let's look at the heart. At rest, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system are influencing the heart. Okay, we talked about the example that if you removed either of those autonomic stimuli from the heart, you would basically set off homeostasis. So I'll say that again. If you remove either the parasympathetic influence or the sympathetic influence of the heart, you would set the body out of homeostasis. If you remove the parasympathetic, the heart rate would skyrocket, it would go too high. If you remove the sympathetic, the heart rate would drop too low. So both of these divisions are required at rest to bring about that stable, steady balance, which is homeostasis. Now, with that said, the parasympathetic system or the parasympathetic division is much more active. It's more active than the sympathetic at rest. So while you're at rest, both of these divisions are not equal. The parasympathetic has slightly more dominance. Okay, so it's not an equal, sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. The parasympathetic is a little bit more dominant at rest. And this image just points out some of the integrating centers, the cardiovascular centers, as well as the respiratory centers, which are located in the brainstem, so the pons and the medulla oblongata. And these are the centers that we said were responsible for integrating the signal, which came to the CNS on afferent fibers, deciding upon the response, and then sending that signal back down to the effector tissues to increase or decrease the autonomic nervous system signals. Okay, now it's important to understand that the hypothalamus plays a role here too, and this is having to do with emotional triggers. So again, if you have a breakup or if you are anxious about a test, this will also stimulate some of this autonomic response, which can increase your respiratory rate, increase your heart rate, so on and so forth. Alrighty. Now this table pretty much summarizes everything we talked about. This is the parasympathetic nervous system versus the sympathetic nervous system, and its effect on several different effector tissues. So the heart, what does the parasympathetic do to the heart? It'll decrease heart rate. The sympathetic will increase heart rate. And then it's also listing some of the adrenergic receptors, which are responsible for these effects. So an example we talked about last time was the beta-2 receptors in the lungs. And we can see that if you activate those beta-2 receptors, you're going to relax the airway, and that's a part of the sympathetic response.